This is my absolute favorite way to cook acorn squash. It's so delicious, you're going to like it too. First thing to do is get the oven going at 400 degrees. We've got 2 acorn squashes here, and they kind of come in a variety of colors. This is the usual acorn squash. This is usually green with some yellow blotching. And usually you can tell when they're ripe, when they start to get a little bit of that yellow blotching. Eventually it'll all turn yellow. But when you've got a mix of yellow and green on there, that's when they're at their best. There are also other varieties that have the exact same shape, but maybe some more vibrant colors. I've had carnival squash is one like that, where it's basically the same thing, but just has some bright colors on the skin. But this is a normal acorn squash that you find at most grocery stores. And when I'm shopping for them, I like to grab the ones that have both green and yellow on the skin. But the easiest way to prepare this is just to cut both the ends off and then go ahead and slice it down the middle. We need to get at those seed pockets. And I'm just going to scrape those seeds out with a teaspoon. And like most squashes, there's a little membrane that lines that whole bulb in there. And if you can get that spoon underneath that membrane, then that whole bunch of seeds just kind of comes up pretty easily. I found that if you kind of go at it kind of surgically, really just kind of take your time, it ends up being a lot easier, because if you just start going at it with the spoon and just making seeds fly everywhere, it just makes a big mess. So I like to just take my time doing this, and generally it works out pretty well. And if you have a little space in your backyard, feel free to save some of those seeds and plant them. They'll grow up and you'll get the exact same fruit that you're looking at on the cutting board here. So these acorn squash have these kind of little lobes that are already a part of the fruit. And it might be tempting to just cut them right along those lines there on the outside of the squash. But for this recipe, I like to cut them just a little bit thicker. So I'll make my cuts kind of in between the lobes, and I'll have about 1.5 to 2 lobes of the squash per slice. Having your pieces a little bit thicker just makes it easier to eat in the end. You'll just have a nice bigger piece of squash that you can cut bites off of, instead of having little bitty slivers of squash. This will work out better in the end this way. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut this squash up into little C shapes here, about 1.5 inches thick or so. And they don't need to be all uniform or anything like that. It doesn't really matter if they're all the same. Next, I'm going to drizzle these squash pieces with a little bit of canola oil. That's my oil of choice. Just going to drizzle it on there and then give them a toss and get all those pieces coated with oil. And the seasoning on these is going to be real simple. Just a sprinkling of salt, a few grinds of the pepper, a little sprinkling of garlic powder, and a little sprinkling of onion powder. And I'll just give those another toss just to get all that seasoning mixed around on all the pieces. Once all the squash pieces are nice and coated in some oil and seasoning, it's time to get the sheet pan ready. This is an aluminum pan. It doesn't matter if it's aluminum or a steel pan. The most important part is to use parchment paper. That's going to give you a really good, nice cooking service, and your squash is not going to stick to the pan at all. Once this squash is cooked, it's going to be really tender, and if you use foil and it sticks at all, you're probably just going to tear it apart trying to get it up off the foil. So if you don't have parchment, I'd suggest getting some for this recipe. But if you have some nice nonstick baking sheets, that'd probably work pretty good too. Now I'm going to put some Parmesan cheese on these squash slices here. And my preferred tool for doing it for this recipe is to use this microplane. If you're not familiar with this, this is just basically the same as a cheese grater, except the holes are much, much smaller, and you get a very, very fine shred. And it works really great for hard cheeses like Parmesan. And I've got a hunk of real Parmesan here. Obviously, you could use a pre-grated Parmesan, and that would probably work, but a lot of times the Parmesan that you buy that's pre-grated probably isn't actually Parmesan cheese, has some other cheeses in it. Probably still good, but I like to use just a real hunk of Parmesan and grate it on there. If you don't have one of these microplanes, you can just use a regular cheese grater, or alternatively a vegetable peeler works pretty good for Parmesan too. You can get some really thin shavings of Parmesan on there. But in this recipe, that's really the key, is to get lots of thin pieces of Parmesan cheese on there, so it'll melt really nicely and provide a crusty Parmesan coating on top of these squash pieces. As you can see, I'm not shy with the Parmesan on this recipe, and this is actually not as much as it looks like here. Those thin shavings are mostly air, but once all that melts, that'll be a nice coating of Parmesan on everything. So in the 400 degree oven those go for 40 to 45 minutes. And 45 minutes later, here's what we've got: a pan of delicious Parmesan crusted acorn squash. You can see most of that Parmesan is melted and coated the slices of squash, and those white pieces that you see that are still white there, those are crunchy. And that cheese that is spilled down onto the parchment paper, that's crunchy too. That's crunchy deliciousness right there. And tonight we're serving this with some roasted chicken legs. And while you can eat the skin on this squash, it is a little bit tough. I usually just like to carve the flesh away from the skin with a sharp knife like that and just kind of eat it like a steak almost, you know, just cut little bites. But that's my recipe for Parmesan crusted acorn squash. I hope you found that useful. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.